In this video, we're going to talk about framing the mesh with curves. I use the technique I'm about to show you to create this alien spacesuit where there are these panel loops here. And what I did was frame each one of them with the extrude curve brush that creates that nice extrusion cylinder. It just helps add that extra little bit of costume detail that makes it feel like there's some kind of piping or life support system or articulation in there. You can use this to create costume details like this. You could use it to create hems. You could use it to create turned edges in metal armor. You can use it to make embroidery. It's really very, very versatile. And once you see this process, I think you'll be able to find ways that you can use it as well. It's originally developed to trace curves around open mesh borders to assist in retopologizing. So if you want to join one mesh to another, you can use the technique I'm about to show you to frame any open holes in your mesh with a curve, and those curves can then be used with the topology brush, as well as being used with the insert mesh brushes, the way that I'm going to do in this demo now. So let's take a look at how this works. Incidentally, you're going to notice that sometimes when you're using ZBrush, you might see that you have a curve stuck on your model. I see this happen a lot with my Gnomon students, where they'll be working and they say, why is there a curve that's stuck around the border edge of my model? Well, this is why. It's supposed to be there if you have selected the frame mesh button. So after watching this video, not only will you know how to use this tool, but if you happen to accidentally click it, you'll know how to turn it off. So this is just one of those pitfalls that I've seen crop up for a lot of new users. So if you're new to ZBrush and watching this series, then that's something to keep in mind. Very similar to the accidentally snapshotting your model to canvas by clicking Shift S instead of Shift D, that accidentally framing parts of your mesh with curves is something that I do see people accidentally do, and this will illustrate what that tool is actually for. So let's get started. So we're going to start with this generic body that is loaded in. It will serve as the suit for this alien. Now, this is just a single-sided, it's not a mesh with thickness, and it's just a generic body. And I've just stretched the hands out a bit to give it some character. But what you see here is actually the NixZ model that comes pre-installed with ZBrush. You'll find it under the Lightbox tool menu. So I've deleted the head, and like I said, I stretched the hand and I took off some of the body details. And by deleting that head, it's created a hollow mesh. So I'll go to the polygroups menu and I'm going to group visible so there's nothing but a single polygroup here. Now I'll divide the mesh a few times, maybe 3 times, just to give myself enough resolution that I can paint a nice crisp mask on here. And I'm just going to use the masking brush to paint some panels. And the mask panels are eventually going to become panel loops. We're going to polygroup them. So I'm going to create some interesting shapes here. Kind of a neat thing when you're doing things like this, like creating geometric shapes on a suit, is to follow the underlying form of the anatomy more or less. You don't have to exactly match it, but we'll do a panel over the abdominals and maybe do a panel that flows around the lateral oblique. It just gives a real natural flow to the design sort of graphic shapes that you're creating for this spacesuit. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly the anatomy underneath. It can just be inspired shapes. So I'm just going to expand some of these shapes out with the mask. And I want to expand the shoulder pad out. So we'll mask this back to here. And then we'll do a little mask for the bicep area. And remember that the character has to be mobile, so you don't want the plating to go over the bends. So we'll follow the extensor muscles here on the forearms. So we'll just bring that down. And we'll do something similar on the underside of the arm there that sort of follows the flexors. Just these nice oval shapes that make some sense on the form. So we just want to create an interesting pattern. So we'll carry it down here into the legs by creating a nice curve that loops around the sartorius muscle and the vastus medialis muscle. And then we'll do a big oval shape here on the outside of the thigh. And of course we can erase by holding down Control and Alt, and you can remove from your mask if you happen to overshoot anything. you can easily subtract from that. And you don't have to worry about them being perfect because we're going to clean them up in just a second. So now that these areas are masked, we'll go to Tool, Polygroups, Group Masked. And then once that's clicked, clear the mask, go into frame mode. You can see we now have polygroups for each one of those areas that was previously masked. So now we'll go to the geometry menu and we'll go to the edge loop submenu and we'll use panel loops. I'm going to turn the elevation down a little bit so it doesn't expand off the surface and make too thick of an inflation to the panel loops. And I'll take thickness and turn that up to about 0.07. I don't want it to be too thick. And we'll turn off double-sided. I don't want it to be double-sided. So now we'll just click panel loops, and it tells me that I have subdivisions. I need to delete my lower subdivision levels, and now it will work. Click panel loops, and that carves these panel loops around each one of those polygrouped islands. Now, if you look at them, they're kind of messy. They don't have a nice clean look about them. So what I'll do now is just go to the deformation menu, and there's this slider here, Polish by Features. If I turn that up in its default setting, it's not going to appear to do anything. But if you turn that little radio button on and then use the slider, now when I turn that up, you see it will clean up that overall look. Make sure the circle is empty. So turn it up really high. You see that it just really polishes things down and makes it feel like a machine kind of organic surface. So now if I Control-Shift-Click on the inner shell, that's like the undersuit, make sure that that's hidden. And I will go to Subtool menu, go to Split, Split Hidden. So everything else that's hidden is split out. So now I've got the separate subtool for just the panels and their thickness. So if you go into frame mode, you can see they still have their individual polygroups. So the thickness and the facing panels are separate groups. So we'll turn off frame mode and let's turn on visibility for the inner suit. Select that one. And then I'm going to go to, let's zoom out a little bit so we can see it properly. I'm going to go to the surface submenu under Tool, Noise Plugin. Let's zoom in on this so we can see it. And I'm going to go to Noise Plugin. I just want to give it kind of a little sci-fi texture. Noise Plugin opens up a noise plug, which actually opens up on my other screen. So I'll have to actually reduce the size of my ZBrush so I can pull that screen over. So there we go. Now if I open the noise plugin, I can drag that onto the screen. So I'll turn on the hex tiles, go to hex tile, click OK. And then I'm going to take Mix Basic Noise down to 0 and take my plugin scale down so I can actually see the tiling and bring the strength up so it's pretty strong. So we'll reverse that. There we go. And click OK. So now we get this hex tiling that's on the undersuit. So if I turn on the paneling, you see the paneling is separate. So we alt-click on the paneling to select that. So now I want to create piping that goes around each one of these panels. So there's like seaming or tubing or just that extra level of detail on the suit to add interest. So what I'll do is Control-Shift-Click on the panels themselves, and that hides the panel thickness. Now I'll do another split hidden. So I have a separate subtool now for the thickness of the panel and the surfaces of the panels themselves. Now we'll go to the stroke menu. And if we open up the curve menus here, you see we have the option to frame mesh right there in the center. So there's frame mesh, and I can do it by border, polygroup, or creased edges. I'm just going to use border and click that. Now every separate polygroup or poly panel has a frame, which is a curve going around it. Now I'll go to Beaver Brush, I for Insert, and I'll use Insert Cylindrical Extrusion, this tube cylinder. Now we're accustomed to using this to draw pipes and tubes that go from point A to point B. But if I have an existing curve like this and I have this brush selected, if I just click on the curve, it's going to add that piping around each instance of that tube or that curve. So let's turn solo off so we can see the rest of the suit. So that gives us this pretty neat little bit of costume detailing. So as we move around, you see it goes around each one of those. Now, if I go to the brush menu and bring depth control down, the curve is still active. So if I click the curve again, it's going to update and sink that curve deeper into the surface. So I can control how deep that tubing appears just by adjusting the depth control. So if we do that again, it sinks down even more. Let's really push it so it's really obvious. Let's bring it down really far and then touch the curve. And you see that it will go even further in. So we can have total control over exactly how deep in the surface that extrusion will appear. So if we're happy with that, click somewhere where there's no curve, and that clears the curves. So that now exists as geometry. So I clear my mask, and there we go. Now I'm going to select the inner suit by alt-clicking on it, and I want to do the same thing around the neckline. I want sort of a bigger tube that goes around the neckline, so it feels like maybe something, a point of attachment maybe for a helmet, for example. So in the stroke menu, under curve functions, I'll frame mesh, and I'll use border. So you see that frames all the border edges, but I don't want all those inner borders selected. So what I'll need to do is tap somewhere off the model or off the curves just to get rid of them. Oops, undo, and let's move down here, and I'll just tap somewhere where there's no curve. There we go. I only want the neckline. That's the only hole that I want to be framed. So I'm going to go ahead and go to frame mode. Now you see that there's no polygroups on this inner suit. So I'm going to create a new polygroup by zooming in here, and I'm going to turn that surface noise off. I'm going to go to B for brush, S for select, and do select lasso. And I'll tell it to OK to switch to that brush. Now, if I use Control Shift and then click on an edge loop, I can hide that loop. So if you click an edge, it will hide that edge ring. So I can now go to polygroups and group visible. Now, if I Control Shift click on the background, that shows that hidden polygroup. There we go. So there is the very last edge or row of edges along the neckline. So I'll go to stroke, change to polygroup. So we won't use creased edges because we don't have anything creased. So we'll turn off border and use polygroup. And then frame mesh. Go to stroke, frame mesh. And there we go. So we get that curve running along the edge of that polygroup. We're not getting it around every single hole in the mesh. So now if I click on it with my insert tube extrusion, it will create that tube around the neckline. But it's too small and it's too deep. So I'm going to reset the depth control and then turn my draw size up so the diameter will be much bigger on the tube. And then you click that curve. And now we've got kind of a bigger, chunkier, sort of retro science fiction kind of detail on that suit. It really does feel like something that Marvin the Martian would wear. So turn off solo, Control, click and drag to clear the masking. And we'll go back to our surface and we'll turn that surface noise back on. Now, if I want to get rid of the curve, just tap somewhere on the model where there is no curve. Control Shift click to hide the tubing, which is a separate piece. And I will go to Subtool, Split, Split Hidden. Now I can divide the suit, and I'm not going to be dividing the pipe that goes around the neckline. And once we've got some divisions, we can go to the surface noise and apply it to the mesh. So that's how we use framing to take a curve, frame specific areas of a model, and then apply insert multi-mesh brushes or use that to help guide our Z-remesher curves or our Z-re topology curves. There's so many different applications for this, but my favorite thing to do is what I've just shown you, which is to use this to help to create interesting little costume details that otherwise would be really time-consuming and difficult to pull off. So I hope you've enjoyed this tip and this chapter has been informative for you, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.